I'm Paul Bianchi. I'm the headmaster at Paideia. I've been here forever, and during that time, I've interviewed and hired hundreds of people. I first met Steve Sigur in the spring of 1974 when we had an opening in the math area. I wasn't a math area, it was the math teacher in our high school. And Steve came in, all I knew about him was he had sent a very brief resume application. And he came in, sat down in my very, very small office, thereby filling my very, very small office. And I was immediately taken back by him. He didn't dress like most people did for coming for an interview. He had combat boots on, old combat boots on. He had an army jacket, an old army jacket. And he wasn't particularly well kempt. But Paideia had some unusual teachers, so we talked, and we talked, and we talked. And I think the interview, I'm known for long interviews, but I think the interview went for 4 hours. We talked in my office, we went on the back playground where Steve explained to me the physics of shooting a basketball at the correct angle. Maybe that's the mathematics of it, shooting a basketball at the correct angle at a hoop. We talked about Northside High School, we talked about growing up in public schools, we talked about everything. And I was fascinated by him, but a little apprehensive, because he clearly, even in this school that had unusual teachers, he was outside of that boundary, or at least he appeared to be outside of that boundary. So we parted after 4 hours, and later that week I called. I called for references. And the only person I can recall that he listed on his reference sheet was the principal of Northside High School. I finally got him, and he sounded like an older man, and he talked the way that my high school principal had talked, and I think a lot of high school principals talked. He barked at people. He didn't really have a conversation with them. He barked at people. I said, first thing I said is, I'm calling because Steve Sigur listed him as a reference. He barked. I hope you can do better than I can to get him to dress up. I don't know what your parents are going to do if it's a private school. It was really bad here. He would never dress up. I allowed it. It's how I had met Steve, and I saw that. And he said, you know, he's supposed to wear a tie sometime. He used to wear one of those little string ties and a coat. When you have to wear a coat, he got one of those intern coats they wear at Grady, and he wore that around with a string tie. I said, oh. And he said, you know something else about him? I said, no, sir, because I was beginning to be intimidated by him, like we all are of our high school principals. He said, you know, I wanted him to improve himself. I wanted to get some professional development. But he wouldn't go to Georgia State in the summer and take those courses for gifted kids. Do you know what he did? No, sir. What did he do? He said he'd go into the Canadian woods, the Canadian Rockies, for a month, and he'd live with the bears. Can you imagine that? He lived with the bears for about a month, and he didn't want to improve himself. I said, beats me. Well, it went on like that for around 5 minutes. I had pretty much tuned out because I figured this guy just didn't like Steve, and he was culturally kind of like way away from Steve, or Steve was way away from him. So finally, as a last question to wrap it up, I said, what kind of a teacher is he? And the principal said, he's the best teacher in the school. I'd give anything if I had another one like him. If I had a faculty of him, it would be a fabulous school. He's the best teacher in the school.
I'm Steve Sigur, and I've been at Paideia since I think the second year of the high school, which is actually quite a long time. Probably a few years more than 30 years. At least that's the way I remember it, but I don't remember dates like that so well. Well, this is the top end of the mathematics program. An awful lot of people have gone from the top end of our mathematics program to go into mathematical kind of things. For example, on my webpage, I have a list of mathematical alumni. You know, that if you take the famous companies that work on technology things, there are Paideia students working at those things, and many of them, a great number of them, came from the seminar class. Well, you have presuppositions about how you think mathematics ought to be done. My presupposition is that the true education that goes on in sports leagues where people get a lot of help from a lot of people. It's a case where older participants help the younger ones. Knowing adults sit around and observe. Same is true in music. That those are my two educational models. I do not consider that the regular academic classroom does a whole lot other than make people mediocre at 4 things at the same time. And there is some use to that. But I don't want people to be mediocre. I want them to be very good. So I try to have a situation where people get put into an unusual circumstance and have to deal with it and have to help each other. And then I like what I call the wise alumni of Paideia to see their work and comment. So I like them to be the experts.
How do the students respond to this?
Well, often they like it. You know, so I think sometimes I think it seems chaotic, but I don't think I've lost anybody on to that because it's not a definite assignment. It's I put you in and you deal with it. It's you know, I push you into the pool and you now have to figure out how to get to the other side. However, you have to collaboratively figure out how to get to the other side, which is a thing of a different order and almost guaranteed to be successful just because people all have different ways of thinking, and when one student gets exposed to 10 different ways of thinking, they find the way that helps them. Okay, so this is sort of like a guided tour of the toys in my room. These toys sort of began because when I went up north to a place where I teach teachers, some of the other people who were teaching teachers were telling me that I should have things be put in students' hands. In fact, a mechanical engineering professor from Harvard said that my students were waiting for me to do that, and that the best way from us to a student's brain, for many students, not all, is actually through their fingers. So another teacher used a system which was actually invented for architects called Zone Tools. And Zone Tools is a very clever way of constructing mathematical objects. So then flash forward a few months after I learned about it, and so I brought these toys into class, I had one of the worst math students we ever had, who was in what's called the Algebra 2A class. I gave him an assignment which involved drawing, and this is one of my great stories educationally, I think. I gave him an assignment that involved drawing, and they were supposed to draw by hand, but he had, being a student who doesn't always follow instructions, he had done it on the computer, and then after he left the room, I saw what he had done on the computer, and I realized he had actually been taking apart conceptually the figures and putting them back together again in a way that was just unbelievably sophisticated. And so I immediately, the next day I went out and said, "You are now doing an independent study." And the guy's name is Thomas Levitt, and as I said, he was like a D math student. Couldn't for the life of him get anything in a math class. But we had some of the best people we have ever had in math that year. You know, were A's, everything in math, and the natural collaborator of the people who were the best was this guy Thomas, who was in grades one of the worst. And Thomas built the 120 cell. He created that for us to do at Paideia. It took him 6 weeks to do, and it took 6 weeks to do because the company that made these things was going to send us some instructions on how to do it, and they never did. So we had to figure it out ourselves. And Thomas in particular figured it out himself because I had never made these things. So when Thomas would tell me things, I would react and say, well, that seems sensible to me, and I would point out things that, you know, things that I could think of as being a place where you could mess up. But anyway, Thomas sort of laboriously constructed this, and that proved it could be done. And once it could be done, guess what? All the students who come into the class where I do these things, they sit there and want to make a large thing like this, right? So we've had an ever-increasing number of constructions of really large things that take a very long time to do. And the amount of mental effort involved, as I always love to say, is these things. So, and that's the 120 cell, and it's, from my point of view, is one of the great things, and I also like it when it turns out that a student who can't do math in a regular class turns out to be one of the great math students in the school. The graduate students at Georgia Tech heard about this, and I remember they came over to see it. And Thomas, this 11th grade kid who is horrible at math, is talking to literally the best students, because I had taught these people in high school, taught these graduate students. So these are literally the best students in the country. And he held them spellbound for an hour and a half, going over all the details of the thing. And I thought that was one of the most amazing things I'd ever seen, where this ne'er-do-well 11th grader could hold these graduate students who are already very experienced with high dimensions, so are used to four-dimensional objects, could hold them spellbound for all the time, just going over all the details. And I was just watching him do that was one of my great educational moments, or whatever. So Catherine Pierce, who had actually caused the four-dimensional class to happen at Paideia, it happened because of a request of hers. So she built the 24 cell. Then other students would build other objects. And I'm not going to go through and describe what all these objects are, but this has an octahedron in the center and is expanding out from the octahedron to turn into a dodecahedron. Now those are standard three-dimensional objects. This is the, I think, the 720 cell. No, it's the 600 cell. That was done by John Terry. Mathematical situations are everywhere, and you just get thrown into them and you have to deal with them. I like making pictures, and that sort of puts a bias on, if the students like what I'm doing, that puts a bias in favor of making pictures, which is called computer graphics. So you'll find Paideia alumni at Pixar, you'll find them at Google, you'll find them at Silicon Graphics, at various places that make pictures on computers. So, and a lot of it started in the seminar class here. It's different than other classes because my personal standard as to what good is that you are good if you are doing what people in the field think is good. Like a good artist is somebody that artists think is good. And a good mathematician is somebody that mathematics think is good. The second statement is that 18-year-olds are genuinely capable of good work. The third thing is A's ain't it. A's are generally not good work. It represents competent work, and that which is often the antithesis of good work. So what I want is the students to do things that people who are themselves good will think is good work, and the fact is they will. That's the missing piece that everybody doesn't know about, is that 18-year-olds can do really good work, and that's never, usually that's just not in the water, that the educational water that people drink. It's usually the educational water is 18-year-olds can make A's. Yeah. Well, I'm born and bred in Atlanta, Georgia, Grady Hospital. And went to Northside High School, then went to Brown University, and then went back and taught at Northside High School, and then went from Northside High School because Allison Arnold's mom was teaching at Northside High School, and then ended up applying to Paideia when they just happened to have a math teacher who was leaving. But also seeing it as an unbelievable opportunity. In a sense, it was like where the teachers could develop, and did, at the same pace the students were developing, because it was co-development, not just the wise person teaching the less wise person, When we had faculty meetings, it was 6 or 7 teachers in the room, and we were trying to figure out what it meant to be a school, and that was absolutely inspiring. What we didn't understand in the early Paideia, which I think we definitely do understand now, is that while a student is quite capable of being interested in things, it's not necessarily their natural state to be interested in anything other than their friends. Paul used to say, if you open the door, they wander out and they do not naturally wander back in. You have to actually herd them back in, and it's your intent to educate that actually produces the education. and the intent has to come first. You can't just let the education happen. I just am a teacher. It's just no doubt. It never occurred to me any other way. I remember when I was in college, they used to say, well, what do you want to do? I said, oh, well, I want to do research in physics and teach high school, which was a contradiction. You can't do that, pretty much. But that was what I said, yeah, I already knew that. Also, when I was in high school, whenever a math teacher was missing, they would have me go teach the class. Like, I do not consider mathematics to be a series of things you know. I consider it a series of things you see. It is a question of perception, not a question of knowledge. And so I try to teach how to see. Why does a person look at a geometry problem, say, and have trouble with it? It's just this maze of gibberish. And whereas what I do is I see points, lines, triangles, squares. I immediately focus on relevant geometrical parts of the picture. So I try to teach them how to do things like that, and with much more sophisticated math too. So it's everything I do is around seeing in a larger sense than just the eyes. So it's the seeing that I teach, and then the formulas and things like that. The formulas being much less important. See, there's always been two parts of me I wanted to teach. Well, you can teach as a college professor, right? But I always thought that college students were exceptionally dull in the kind of things I wanted them to be not dull at. Whereas high school students weren't. Yeah, high school students were bouncy and so forth, and college students you had to drag from place to place. First of all, I'm actually two kinds of teacher. I'm an old teacher, which is significant because in a certain sense the school has to be created by the young teachers. The young teachers have to come in and ask questions and look at the way we do things and not understand it and say, this puzzles me. I'm not sure if I was doing it, I don't. So they in a sense have to do their job, and then I have to do my job.
I see that you're wearing the shirt with the logo ARML, and I wanted to ask you about the ARML teams. What is this?
This is it stands for American Regions Mathematics League. It's a league, quote, that meets once in June, and any contiguous region, meaning self-contained region, can send a team. So, and that's, and in a lot of ways, the thing I like best of the whole year of what I do is it has nothing to do with Paideia, or very little to do with Paideia, is I get on a bus with the 32 best math kids from the state, and we travel for a day and a half to get to Penn State University, and that bus ride is the most amazing thing, right? Because I very strongly have the view that if you have an ability, the adults around you have to help you develop it. It doesn't naturally develop. It will develop, but it doesn't naturally. And in dancing, in basketball, in soccer, the adults naturally do that. In math, it does not happen. And so I decided to make that happen. And so we now have adults all over who are helping. So we're developing really, really good math kids in the state of Georgia.
I understand that you were named national coach.
I was the coach of the year last year. I sit at the moment having cancer, of which I do not know what's going to happen with. Right now it looks pretty good, but who knows. And one of the things that happened because of that is I've just renewed so many acquaintances of people I'd either partly lost or totally hadn't seen. So I've actually had a lot of these kind of things. And you know, like there's this like I just spent 2 or 3 hours last weekend talking with Ken Lau, who works out at Pixar, and he was saying that the thing that worked for him when he was in high school is that math hit him in 100 ways. That math came from music, right? Math came from pictures. Math came from formal math courses. Math came from proofs. That was the important thing, was that the math hit him in 100 ways. That he see that doing math and doing art, for example, is not totally distinct activities. That sound comes from sine functions, which is trigonometry. And that you can, just like you can play with graphs and make unusual shapes, you can play with sine functions and make unusual sounds. And that, all of those kind of things was a big deal for him, and I think that's the thing. I think that's is you should see that math, that when everything you do on a computer is somebody wrote math to do it, and they're all doing such interesting things now. So like, Nina Glass is going to be a doctor. David Berger is working on economics. Mike Carr is teaching as a high school math teacher. Andrew Berry is working for a consulting corporation up north. But they all have such interesting things to say. Catherine Pierce is just graduating with a degree in the philosophy of mathematics from Oxford, right? So guess what? That's interesting things to talk about there, right? And so, it's a great bunch of folks. So.
Did you have a Steve Sigur in your background that sort of helped shepherd you along?
I think because I was a sort of a warm-up for the modern age, and that I didn't really have, the whole family fell apart. And I always say I'm an example of what happens when you get raised with no parents. My mom was mentally ill. My dad just disappeared, just out of the picture. So, and I was raised by whoever was around. But the Old South, which the very end of it, I grew up in, as I love to say, is I knew a lot of people who remembered the Civil War when I was growing up, and really remembered Reconstruction with great bitterness. But it was, people were living in the same houses that their parents lived in, and whereas now the houses turn over very quickly. So I was actually raised by my community, and so there was no, I had a basketball coach who was clearly very important, but pretty much it was my community that raised me. Because they just sort of knew to take care of me. Like I went over to Northside High School, and they knew that they had to be sympathetic to me, just or something like that. And they pretty much all were, and they all would facilitate. And all the men in the community decided I should be helped to become a basketball player. So they would teach me hook shots, which are often obsolete, or already an obsolete form of basketball at that point. But nonetheless, that was just an illustration of. So in a certain sense, the community I was raised in did that for me. So as opposed to one person. Supposedly, you get hit at the age of 14 or something for math kind of things, and that was true of me. So I decided I liked physics, and there was my uncle's calculus book was in the basement, so in order to know physics, I gathered you had no calculus, so I started reading the calculus book. And I remember going up to my high school teacher saying, well, I've been learning some calculus, and it just was a statement that made no sense to her as my Algebra 1 teacher. Right? And she didn't even react to it, and I learned that I should never bring that up. And I never did, pretty much. I just did it on my own. Sports is because I'm big. Sports, my body doesn't work very well, so I can't do sports anymore. So that sort of faded out, but it was unbelievably important. Sports gave me a model of something that was a community activity that was effective. And when I sit down and think of how I want the math program at Paideia to be, the perfect model is how many basketball teams or soccer teams are done, which is you have, imagine you're a 14-year-old soccer player. Well, the 16-year-old soccer players serve as an inspiration and also show you things. And then the 18-year-olds serve as an inspiration and show you things. And then all the adults contribute. The parents sit and watch. They assess your progress, and then they comment on it, all right? And at every level, something is being fed to you. And that to me is the way things like math should be. And then all of a sudden, I just decided I wanted to coach. And I remember Paul coming up to me and say, that made me so happy. And I ended up starting with the 8th grade basketball, which was really fun. And you know, and people like Paul and Bernie would come to watch because I was often coaching his kids, and so forth. So so I started, and I was coaching Chad Hayes and Andrew Burr, who were famous Paideia athletes and well known around Paideia as well. And so that was just, you know, that was first of all really fun. And then I ended up being the varsity coach for a while, and I considered myself the first serious boys varsity coach. And then then one year there was no girls varsity coach, so I coached the girls varsity, and that was actually the first year that Paideia was ever ranked in the state for basketball, and we were ranked 5th, I believe, at some point. Yeah, I have performed on the bassoon, the oboe, the flute, the electric guitar, the bass, acoustic guitar, banjo, dobro, flute, penny whistle, kazoo.
Was that the comb and the wax paper, the actual?
Pretty much. No, this is an actual kazoo that I bought for 15 cents or something. So I've performed at all those things, not always wonderfully, you know. I'm better on certain ones than others, of course. But to me, part of that was, and also I approach the instruments. You see, the instruments are objects of physics. They are things that have vibrating strings. They have things that the vibration gets amplified. So I don't just think of it as a way of making music. I think of it as as a mathematical device or a physical device going on as well. I tend to think sort of folky in the way I think about music. And Joni thinks as a cellist, as a classically trained cellist. And at first, it was very difficult for Joni, I think, but we very quickly, within, say, week and a half, sort of established how we could go together. And so we wrote all the music, which music for a play consists of leitmotifs, like a certain character has a certain music, right? And then you have to change scenes, so you often want to cover the changing of scene with music. And so we sort of learned those little uses of music, and so we performed The Hobbit, and then we also started another tradition, which is after we compose all the music, we then assemble it into an overture.
I understand that you would now and again go off to the Canadian woods for a month with a fish hook and a, 30 bags of rice. I wondered if you could talk about that experience.
Well, what I would do is for every day I was going to be out, I would take a little palmful of rice and a little palmful of lentils, and the reason for that was because the one thing you can't get in the middle of summer is starches. You can get berries, you can get fish, and so forth, but roots and grains haven't grown yet. The roots are hiding during the summer. They're all impossible to eat. They're all, and then they become rich tubers later in the year, right? I also can't even begin to say how much that's affected me. I mean, the idea of just being alone with the world by yourself for a month, there just isn't anything like it.
Well, I remember taking this course, Edible Plants, from you in the 70s. Did you continue to teach that course and talk a little bit about it?
Not many times. I taught it several times. You see, like the first time we taught it, there's some maple trees right next to Paideia, and so we tapped the maple trees and got maple syrup.
I wondered how you feel about talking about your current illness. You feel comfortable about that?
I have no problem with that, yeah.
So tell me when you found out and what it is you have.
Well, I have I found out because I was driving down the street and I found myself drifting to the right. And then when the policeman came, I clearly was not really very much, it's not lack of control, I just wasn't aware of where I was and what I was doing exactly. And what had happened is I had had a seizure due to a brain tumor. and the brain tumor is a type called glioblastoma, which is a really bad one.
Prior to the diagnosis, did you think into the future that you would want to sort of stay there till your last breath, or are there things that you wanted to do after life there?
Well, I'm coming to the end of, or have almost come to the end of writing a book, and that book I was going to have illustrated. It was going to be full color every page, and it's going to be shaped like a triangle, so it's going to be an unusual publishing event, and I will have also co-written a book. So all of a sudden, that to some extent gave me options. So what it would give me options, right? So so one of the things I was sitting there thinking is that I might move down to teaching 3 classes or 2 classes. I don't, and then see what see if I want to design books. I never thought that I wasn't going to be teaching, and I never thought that I wasn't going to be teaching at Paideia.
Well, I really want to thank you so much for
Well, thank you.
for laying it all out and talking it all over.
And you're one of the people I sit down and think wonderful things about from ancient times. So
Likewise.
yes.
Thank you, Steve.
Sure.